Hi, welcome back to another Blazor build. Today we build an accessible star rating component following the Aria Authoring Practices Guidelines, and for those who switch to Blazor to reduce writing JavaScript, this component does not need any custom JavaScript adding. On screen are 5 instances of the component showing the various parameter options utilising both one- and two-way bindings. Using the mouse gives you the typical experience of stars lighting up or disappearing on hover, turning solid to indicate the selection. A disabled control using Aria disabled attribute shows the not allowed cursor when using the mouse. A read-only instance is displayed like a graphic due to the Aria role of image. I will briefly describe each instance prior to using the component with the keyboard and the free screen reader NVDA. The first instance has a visible rating label of Michelin Star Rating, using a rating scale of 3 stars with no initial value. As there is no selected star, we will land on the first star when tabbed to. The Aria Authoring Guidelines, as well as the browser default, is that after you tab to the component, it is then the arrow keys that move and select items. When there is no initial selection, you can either use the space key to select the first star or the arrow key to select the second star, after which the space key has no effect.
Speech mode beeps. Speech mode talk. Michelin star rating, grouping. 1-star radio button not checked 1 of 3. Space, checked. 2-star radio button checked 2 of 3.
I tabbed to the component and NVDA announced Michelin Star Rating, grouping. 1-star radio button not checked 1 of 3. I pressed the space key and NVDA announced space checked. I pressed the right arrow key to move to the second star and NVDA announced 2-star radio button checked 2 of 3. Whichever direction I move in, the announcement will always be checked for the star just navigated to, with the others becoming not checked. The component uses a radio group, and a group can only ever have a single checked item. The visual display shows all stars up to and including the checked star as selected. The next instance has a visible label, this time using a rating scale of 5 stars.
Product review, grouping. 4-star radio button checked 4 of 5.
When I pressed the tab key, we left the first component instance and landed on the selected star of the second instance with NVDA announcing product review, grouping, 4-star radio button checked, 4 of 5. The third instance has a visual label, uses 5 stars, but also has a star size of enhanced. The smaller stars have the target size of 24 pixels, with the larger stars enhanced having the WCAG enhanced target size of 44 pixels.
Service rating, grouping. 3-star radio button checked 3 of 5.
I tabbed to and landed on the selected third star of the third instance, with NVDA announcing service rating, grouping, 3-star radio button checked 3 of 5. The fourth instance has a hidden label and uses the enhanced star size. It also uses the Aria disabled attribute, disabling mouse and arrow key behaviour, with styling applied to make it look like it is disabled.
Movie rating, grouping unavailable. 5-star radio button unavailable checked 5 of 10.
This time when I tabbed to the component, NVDA announced movie rating, grouping, unavailable. 5-star radio button unavailable, checked, 5 of 10. If I move with the arrow keys, NVDA will continue to announce unavailable, continuing to read but with no selection changes being made.
6-star radio button unavailable not checked 6 of 10. 7-star radio button unavailable not checked 7 of 10. 6-star radio button unavailable not checked 6 of 10. 5-star radio button unavailable checked 5 of 10.
The last instance is not showing the rating label, uses the enhanced star size and is set to be displayed as read-only. As there is no read-only attribute for a radio group, in a form you would typically only have this control enabled or disabled. In order for component use with static displays, when the component's read-only parameter is set to true, the component will use the role of image instead of radio group, only rendering the star icons, with the screen reader announcing the star rating value.
Movie rating, 8 out of 10 graphic.
I press the escape key to exit the radio group and then press G, which is the key that is used to move to the next graphic, jumping over elements in between. NVDA announced movie rating 8 out of 10 graphic. Movie rating was the hidden label, 8 was the rating value, 10 was the maximum value, with the text out of coming from a component parameter. That's it for the demo. Let's review the component on the home page before going through the project structure and code, so you can comfortably build your own component from scratch, or use my code freely available on GitHub as a starting point. The link to the source code is in the video description below. All instances are showing all of the parameters excluding the optional one that I use for my theming scheme. The rating label parameter is required, with all others having default values if not entered. I have used two-way binding for all components except the last, which was meant to be read-only, so I only use one-way binding with a static value for that one. The Aria rating name parameter value gets prefixed with the radio button value and is what gets announced by the screen reader. For example, 1 star, radio button checked 1 of 5. Before we discuss the project structure, I should also point out the content / assembly name syntax on line 11 to get access to our component's project style sheet. The project structure is typical to most of my videos, using the Blazor web app template, selecting interactive server using the interactivity location of global, but any interactive project type would do. I then added a Razor library project to the solution named Blazor builds.components for the star rating component, updating the server project references, and both imports.razor files with any using statements when necessary. I take this approach so you can see how all of the pieces fit together if you wanted to build a separate component library which you could then deploy as a NuGet package for use in other projects. As I use Sassy CSS, a CSS preprocessor, I used a free Visual Studio Marketplace extension, as this functionality is not out of the box with Visual Studio. I made a short 4-minute video about the extension that I use and getting started with it. The link for both the extension and video is in the video description below. If this is the first video of mine that you have watched, please note that I keep all of the settings the same, so once you have set things up, you're good for all the other videos. Within the web root of the components project, I added an assets folder with a CSS subfolder for the style sheet that gets output from the Sassy CSS. I then added a related project folder assets with a subfolder SCSS for 3 Sassy CSS partial files denoted by the leading underscores in their name, and a main.scss file used to state what we want in the final output. The root partial file, as always, just contains a few global CSS variables common to my other components from my CSS framework. A change to one global CSS variable at design time or runtime affects all components that use that variable, a simple theming technique. The SVG icons partial file is where I place all icons for a component, in this instance just 2. Instead of using a class selector, I marked them as placeholders so I could include the content in other classes using the Sassy CSS extend directive, as we will see next. The star rating partial file contains all of the component's styles. On line 1 is a use directive so we can access the placeholders from the SVG icons partial file. I use the B.E.M block element modifier naming convention for CSS, and the star rating class forms the block part of this. My elements are those that have the double underscores with modifiers using double dashes. For those new to Sassy CSS, the ampersand is not the same as the ampersand in native CSS nesting. In Sassy CSS, the ampersand denotes the parent selector and will concatenate the text after the ampersand with the parent selector to form a new selector. For example, ampersand double underscore controls, when output, will create the star rating double underscore controls class. The first three local variables just control the star size and colour, with a modifier being used to increase the size to 44 pixels. I use the Aria disabled attribute to alter or stop styles from being applied when the element should look disabled. The controls element on line 24 is a wrapper around a div that holds the icon with its content being the radio button. Because the SVG icons make use of the mask properties, I believe that hinders showing borders and outlines, something I need to read up on, so I just used another element to get the outline to display for keyboard users. Luckily, the has selector is now widely supported, so I used that to get an outline around the div when the focus was inside it and the radio button was being accessed by keyboard users. The icon element on line 33 just sets the default properties and creates the transition for the stars, with the modifiers dictating whether it's a solid star or the outline star. The button element is for the input type radio elements, and I used appearance none to get rid of its styles. The border and outline none are most likely redundant, but left there just in case. Finally, we have a label element set to display block for the text that appears above the rating stars if not hidden using the modifier. Next, the main.scss file. This just has use directives to have the content from the partial files included in the main CSS file that is output in the CSS folder within the web root. We then have my usual common folder with the subfolders enums and seeds. Within the enums file, we just have 3 enums used by the component. The style as enum is just something specific for my theming scheme, and I add it to all of my components. The values assigned to the rating scale constants determine how many stars the component will render, and the star size is used to determine the size of the star, the normal 24 pixel size one or the enhanced 44 pixel one. The seeds folder contains a global values file that contains string constants used by the component and a single static helper method for my theming scheme. We then have the star rating folder for our component. As this component does not have much markup or code, I find it simpler with such components just to use the single razor file approach and not split the file into markup and code behind. First, we have our containing div, and dependent on whether the component is to be displayed as read-only, we either set the role to image or radio group. We use the Aria labeled by attribute to provide text for assistive technologies which point to either one or both of the spans on lines 5 and 6. When the role is the radio group, we just use the span that has the content for the rating label, which may or may not be visible. But when we are using the role of image, we then need the rating label and additional information regarding the rating value. The role of image effectively allows you to take a group of items and treat them as a single image. Exactly what we want, as we have an SVG for each rating value, but only need to communicate the overall result to screen reader users. It should also be noted that the Aria labeled by attribute can reference elements hidden using display none. Yet again, perfect for our needs. We also make use of the Aria disabled attribute, which is either true or false when we are not displaying the controller's read-only. If it's read-only, we use null, which causes Blazor to exclude the attribute from being rendered. The first span on line 5 just gets the appropriate classes based on whether or not the rating label is to be shown. I envisaged the second span as always being hidden, so I just used an inline style to save adding another class, but you could certainly add another parameter to have the option to show this one. We then, within a loop, dependent on the read-only display value, add either our control grouping or a span with the star icon. For the mouse over and mouse out handlers, I added a Boolean parameter for the disabled flag, as I believe the prevent default is not applicable to these events, and we need to stop this behavior when the component is in a disabled state. As a side note, the HTML disabled attribute removes focusable elements from the tab sequence, which may cause a screen reader user to miss. Hence why I prefer the use of the Aria disabled attribute handling the disabled state myself. When I was building this component, at the back of my mind I was wondering how I could stop the arrow keys from making a selection without the use of the HTML disabled attribute or using JavaScript. But luckily, and something that I did not realise, was that browsers, when using the arrow keys for radio buttons, actually use the click event for selections. So just by adding the prevent default to the onClick event needed to prevent mouse user selections, this also prevented arrow key selections. The span for the icons, when read-only, are marked with the Aria hidden attribute to ensure that these are hidden from assistive technologies, as their users only need the Aria label announcements for the overall rating value. Next up, the C# code. The parameters on lines 33 through 45 are all self-explanatory. The only thing to note is the use of the editor required attribute to warn the user that the rating label is required. The event callback rating value changed uses the Blazing naming convention of adding the suffix changed to the parameter that requires two-way binding. The private fields just hold values for the markup and/or shadow parameter values received. Within the onParameterSet method that gets invoked every time the parent causes a render, we check the value of the rating value to ensure that it's within the bounds of the rating scale, assigning the appropriate value to our shadowing field. We also assign a value to our roving index field. By default, browsers will set the focus to the first selected radio button star when using tab keys. However, when no radio button stars are selected, depending on the browser, tabbing will generally go to the first radio button star, but using Shift plus Tab may go to the last radio button star. The Aria Authoring Practices Guidelines mentions this, with their radio group example always going to the first radio button, so I added the roving index in line with their example. We use the one-time uninitialized event to raise an exception if the user ignored the editor required warning and failed to provide the required rating label value, assigning other parameter values to the shadowing fields. I assign values to shadowing fields when I want non-changing values for the markup, preventing a change during runtime. For example, having the rating scale change while the user is using the component doesn't make much sense, unlike having the control disabled in certain circumstances does make sense. The onSelectionChanged event handler just returns the selected star value to the parent component when two-way binding is being used. The onMouseOver or Out event handler is the handler for both the mouse over and mouse out events. We use this to capture which star the mouse is over and to zero it on mouse out, storing the value in the hovered item field. Within the getStarIcon modifier class method that is called from the markup to get the appropriate class for the stars, solid or outlined, we check if we are dealing with a mouse over, and if so, get the star class based on the star's underlying buttons index relative to the hovered item. Otherwise, we just return the class based on whether or not the button index is less than or equal to the selected value. We show solid stars for those below the selected value and outline stars for those above. The getStarRating classes method is another helper called from the markup to get the container's star rating class and the modifier if the enhanced star size is used. The last method, getLabelClasses, also called from the markup, just gets the label class or the modifier if it's to be hidden. As the modifier is just using a display none, we can omit including the class that it modifies. And with that we are done. As usual, you are free to leave good or bad comments, and I will do my best to answer any questions raised. The link to the source code or other projects or videos mentioned are all in the video description below. Thanks for watching. Until next time, bye for now.